It was still dark outside when security doors opened, phones started buzzing, and a tall man stepped forward quietly, moving like somebody who already knew the ending before anyone else did. No names came first, only timestamps, controlled voices, embassy walls, and paperwork waiting on signatures tied to sealed cases and people who never made it this far. That walk ended years of hiding, international coordination, and bodies already counted in separate courtrooms across two countries. The moment did not begin that morning, though, since the loop closed there but started decades earlier in a colder place under bright lights. To understand how that door opened, you have to rewind far back before indictments, before cocaine, before anyone whispered cartel names. Ryan James Wedding was born on September 14, 1981, in Thunder Bay, Ontario, a city where winter sticks around long enough to shape habits, patience, and discipline early. His family background leaned heavily toward competitive skiing culture, with relatives involved in alpine sports, coaching, and resort operations that treated snow as both workplace and proving ground. From childhood, daily structure mattered more than comfort, since training schedules, travel logistics, and seasonal moves became normal routines rather than special events. By his early teenage years, the family relocated to Coquitlam, British Columbia, specifically to place him closer to better facilities, stronger competition, and national development programs. At 12, Wedding shifted fully into snowboarding, gravitating toward parallel giant slalom, a discipline demanding timing, balance, aggression, and repeatable precision under direct comparison. He entered local and regional races constantly, stacking heats week after week, learning how performance replaced personality when adults evaluated progress and funding opportunities. Coaches tracked splits, placements, and reaction times closely, while parental investment reportedly reached tens of thousands annually for equipment, travel, and training camps. That constant evaluation created a narrow identity, since results dictated movement, funding, and attention, leaving little room for backup plans or hesitation. By 15, Wedding earned placement on Canada's National Development Pipeline, where overseas travel became routine rather than a reward. Training camps in Europe and South America exposed him early to international circuits, unfamiliar environments, and competitive pressure without safety nets. In 1999, he captured a bronze medal at the Junior World Championships, followed by a silver medal in 2001, signaling consistency rather than a sudden breakout. Those finishes placed him squarely inside Olympic consideration, not as a headline favorite, but as a reliable contender trusted to execute under structure. Olympic qualification followed the numbers, not hype, since his times met standards established by Alpine Canada and the Canadian Olympic Committee. No miracle conversations happened, no inspirational speeches rewrote the math, since his inclusion reflected accumulated points, rankings, and disciplined compliance. Everything he had done since childhood led logically toward Salt Lake City, framed less as destiny and more as scheduled arrival. By early 2002, his entire world compressed into one event where fractions of seconds separated remembered names from forgotten ones. On February 14, 2002, at the Salt Lake City Winter Olympics, Ryan Wedding lined up for the men's parallel giant slalom event under deteriorating course conditions. 32 riders entered qualification, each run measured precisely, with no allowances for reputation, prior medals, or development investment. Wedding completed his run in 38.61 seconds, placing 24th overall, finishing just over 1 second outside advancement into later rounds. That single second eliminated any chance at podium visibility, television exposure, or post-Olympic momentum within elite snowboarding circles. Once competition ended, attention moved immediately toward medalists like Switzerland's Philipp Schock, while lower placements disappeared from coverage entirely. There was no scandal, no controversy, no injury explanation offered publicly, only a quiet exit shared by most athletes who missed qualification. For the sport, results were final, archived, and replaced by the next broadcast, while the athlete returned home without ceremony or roadmap. That silence marked the first real gap between effort and outcome that structure alone could not absorb anymore. Back in Canada, Wedding attempted reintegration through Simon Fraser University, enrolling in business studies while searching for direction beyond competition schedules. He shifted focus toward bodybuilding and physical presence, supplementing income by working as a nightclub bouncer in Vancouver's nightlife circuit. Those environments rewarded size, intimidation, and confidence differently than sanctioned sports, offering immediate feedback without rankings or committees. Meanwhile, the support systems that once managed logistics, travel, and evaluation slowly dissolved, leaving decisions unmonitored and accountability self-directed. Within that drift, ambition changed shape since financial opportunity replaced performance metrics as the new scoreboard. Real estate speculation and marijuana cultivation entered his orbit through associates and informal introductions rather than institutional pipelines. By the mid-2000s, Wedding had moved from scheduled competition toward unsupervised ventures where risk carried profit instead of penalties. That transition did not feel like failure internally, since a new measurement of success had quietly taken hold, setting the stage for what followed next. By the mid-2000s, Ryan Wedding was no longer chasing recognition or structured approval, since the new focus centered on systems that produce cash without crowds, judges, or televised scoreboards. Marijuana entered his life less like a counterculture move and more like a logistical solution, since demand stayed consistent while enforcement relied heavily on visibility and proximity. He gravitated toward warehouse grows outside Vancouver, places where square footage, lighting cycles, and electrical load mattered more than street presence. One operation, later nicknamed 18 Carat Farms, operated out of a large industrial property in Maple Ridge, British Columbia, structured around volume rather than flair. The goal stayed simple and repeatable, with product moving quietly while ownership stayed layered behind shell arrangements and borrowed names. What mattered most inside those operations was distance, since Wedding rarely appeared on site and avoided tying himself directly to paperwork, leases, or utility accounts. Properties often sat under associates' names, while financial flows moved through informal channels designed to blur responsibility rather than eliminate it. That separation created insulation, allowing growth cycles to run while minimizing direct exposure if attention drifted too close. The system rewarded patience and planning, since profit depended on avoiding disruption instead of overpowering competition. In that space, money arrived steadily, reinforcing the idea that structure itself could act as protection. In 2006, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police raided the Maple Ridge warehouse, uncovering a large-scale cannabis grow alongside weapons and equipment tied to production. Wedding was not present during the raid, and his name did not appear on the warrant, lease, or primary documentation connected to the property. Prosecutors later cited insufficient evidence to charge him directly, turning the bust into a missed grab rather than a formal consequence. Instead of fear, the raid landed as confirmation, reinforcing that distance worked when systems were built correctly and ownership stayed layered behind other names. The message came through clearly, since separation meant survival while proximity invited risk, and paper trails mattered more than physical presence in moments like that. After that moment, the scale began reshaping tolerance, since each successful cycle lowered anxiety while raising appetite for larger returns. Marijuana still paid well, though ceilings existed once volume hit predictable limits and enforcement adapted accordingly. Wedding absorbed that reality quickly, recognizing that higher tiers required products with stronger margins and networks capable of absorbing heavier pressure. The lesson from the raid stayed embedded, though ambition widened, pushing him towards substances where profit expanded faster than oversight. That transition did not feel reckless internally, since the same logic still applied, only multiplied across a broader terrain. Cocaine entered the picture as an extension of an already working formula, since the move followed capital flow logic rather than emotional escalation or street bravado. By 2008, Wedding aligned himself with intermediaries tied to international supply chains, including figures connected to the Akundov drug trafficking organization. The plan focused on procurement rather than distribution theatrics, with expectations built around repeatable transactions rather than one-time scores. A deal in San Diego, California became the entry point, structured around purchasing multiple kilograms after verifying quality through a paid sample. Every step mirrored previous systems, only now involving federal attention instead of provincial oversight. On June 13, 2008, Wedding flew from Vancouver to San Diego, with two associates meeting an individual they believed represented a reliable cocaine source. The exchange followed standard protocol, with money prepared, quantities discussed, and future volumes projected if initial terms satisfied expectations. What Wedding did not know was that the supplier was an FBI undercover informant, turning the entire interaction into controlled surveillance. Federal agents moved in shortly after the exchange, arresting Wedding and his associates in a parking lot before any product reached Canadian soil. The interruption ended the transaction immediately, though it did not collapse the underlying logic driving it. Authorities recovered approximately $100,000 in cash from Wedding's hotel room, strengthening the federal case built around conspiracy to distribute cocaine. In November 2009, after trial proceedings in the United States District Court, Wedding was convicted and later sentenced in May 2010 to 48 months in federal custody. The sentence landed lighter than guidelines suggested, partly due to courtroom presentation and expressions of contrition. Instead of panic, the outcome introduced proximity to a new environment filled with experienced traffickers, brokers, and connectors. Jail did not halt motion, since exposure replaced punishment inside that ecosystem. Wedding served time at Reeves County Detention Complex in West Texas, a privately run facility known for overcrowding and high turnover among federal detainees. Within that space, conversations replaced introductions, since proximity forced interaction among people already operating beyond local frameworks. He met Jonathan Acevedo Garcia, a Canadian trafficker with established cross-border connections and a similar time remaining. That relationship formed slowly through shared routines and controlled exchanges, setting the groundwork that extended far beyond release dates. By the time Wedding exited custody in December 2011, he was not left isolated, since new networks traveled with him quietly. Reeves County Detention Complex in West Texas did not operate like a place designed for reflection or reform, since it functioned more like a holding grid where bodies rotated constantly through shared space. The facility held thousands of federal detainees at any given time, many awaiting immigration proceedings or drug cases, creating a dense mix of languages, backgrounds, and criminal experience. Overcrowding forced proximity, while understaffing removed insulation, meaning conversations happened whether people wanted them or not. In that environment, silence carried weight, observation mattered, and patience separated those planning from those panicking. For someone like Wedding, the setting felt less like confinement and more like an unsupervised conference room. Wedding adjusted quickly, keeping his posture low while listening carefully, absorbing how other inmates discussed routes, enforcement gaps, and mistakes that led to arrest. He avoided loud personalities, instead gravitating toward people who spoke in measured terms and referenced logistics rather than bravado. Jonathan Acevedo Garcia stood out in that space, a Canadian trafficker from Montreal serving time for ecstasy distribution with cross-border experience. Their conversation started cautiously, circling shared geography, similar charges, and mutual understanding of how distance protected leadership. No promises were formed early, since both men understood information traveled faster than loyalty inside federal custody. Trust was built gradually through repetition rather than emotion, since both men shared fragments instead of full stories. Wedding discussed systems without naming players, while Acevedo Garcia referenced routes without revealing endpoints, allowing overlap without exposure. That controlled exchange created rhythm, where consistency mattered more than volume, and silence carried as much meaning as speech. Over time, mutual respect developed through restraint, since neither man pushed boundaries or rushed conclusions. The partnership took shape quietly, grounded in shared patience rather than excitement. During incarceration, Wedding married an Iranian-born Persian-Canadian entrepreneur from British Columbia, holding the ceremony inside prison walls in February 2011. The marriage did not shift his trajectory or soften his outlook, since it functioned as continuity with life outside rather than emotional escape. Paperwork, visits, and communication continued operating under restriction, reinforcing how structure governed everything he touched. That moment reinforced stability rather than romance, aligning personal life with the same controlled approach applied elsewhere. Nothing about prison interrupted momentum, since connections and planning continued despite physical limits. When Wedding walked out of Reeves County in December 2011, after completing his sentence, he did not step into uncertainty or recovery. Deportation back to Canada marked a transition, not a release, since plans already existed beyond the gate. Relationships formed inside traveled with him conceptually, ready to activate once geography allowed movement. Freedom did not feel like relief, since it simply removed barriers delaying execution. That exit closed one chapter while triggering the next phase quietly. Wedding's return to Canada did not resemble reintegration, since nothing pulled him back toward ordinary routines or legal employment. Montreal became a staging area rather than a destination, allowing proximity to establish contacts without inviting unnecessary attention. He reconnected with Acevedo Garcia almost immediately, aligning timelines, roles, and expectations formed years earlier inside Reeves County. Conversations centered on expansion rather than correction, since incarceration had clarified weaknesses rather than discouraged ambition. The operation moved forward without pause, building on frameworks already tested. Within months, planning accelerated, with discussions covering maritime access, trucking networks, and financial channels designed to handle heavier volume. Wedding positioned himself above daily handling, focusing instead on coordination, dispute resolution, and capital flow. That separation mirrored lessons learned earlier, ensuring visibility stayed minimal while influence expanded quietly. Associates filled operational gaps, handling transportation, storage, and regional oversight without direct supervision. Everything moved forward under layered communication, reinforcing insulation at each level. In early 2015, Canadian authorities launched RCMP Operation Harrington, targeting a network connected to cocaine importation through the Caribbean into eastern Canada. Undercover officers infiltrated meetings, recording conversations involving Wedding and associates discussing quantities reaching thousands of kilograms. In April 2015, coordinated arrests resulted in the seizure of over 200 kilograms of cocaine and the detention of multiple figures tied to the operation. Wedding was not among those arrested, having already removed himself from reachable jurisdiction. The pressure arrived late, landing on infrastructure rather than leadership. That timing confirmed earlier instincts, since Wedding had already shifted location in anticipation of escalation. Mexico offered something Canada could not, combining geographic distance with cartel-controlled protection structures. The move did not happen overnight, since preparation involved contacts, resources, and assurances established through intermediaries. By the time authorities intensified their pursuit, Wedding was already embedded within a larger framework offering concealment and enforcement. Panic never entered the equation, since relocation followed long-standing calculations. Entry into Mexico placed Wedding under the umbrella of organizations operating on a scale far beyond anything previously encountered. Protection came at a cost, though it also delivered access, stability, and reach across continents. That shift marked a turning point, since his role transitioned from trafficker to coordinator within a transnational machine. From that point forward, operations expanded rapidly, guided by structures immune to individual disruption. What started as separation for safety now became integration at the highest level. Once settled in Mexico, Ryan Wedding operated less like a street figure and more like a coordinator bound by terms, timelines, and enforcement guarantees negotiated through intermediaries tied to the Sinaloa cartel. The relationship functioned on contract logic, since protection, access, and movement came in exchange for reliability, discretion, and consistent volume. There were no speeches, flags, or ideology involved, only expectations measured by delivery and payment. Wedding understood quickly that emotion created noise, while predictability kept doors open. That understanding allowed him to move inside cartel-controlled territory without needing public acknowledgement. Cocaine sourcing began in Colombia, where producers moved product through established corridors toward coastal departure points overseen by trusted handlers. Loads traveled by air or sea into Mexico, arriving at reception zones coordinated by cartel logistics teams. From there, shipments moved north by truck, often broken into standardized quantities designed to reduce loss if intercepted. Southern California served as a critical redistribution hub, with stash houses positioned near freeway access and border routes. Each leg of the journey relied on redundancy, ensuring delays in one corridor never stopped the overall flow. Once inside the United States, the product continued moving without lingering, since speed mattered more than concealment at that stage. Tractor trailers carried sealed loads toward Canada, using legitimate commercial routes and rotating drivers unfamiliar with the full scope. Canadian distribution followed similar logic, with handoffs designed to keep leadership distant from handling. Jonathan Acevedo Garcia coordinated communication across borders, translating instructions into actionable steps without exposing origin points. Reliability became currency, since missed windows or sloppy execution threatened entire chains. Weddings' inner circle included figures like Andrew Clark, later known by aliases including El Dictador, whose role focused on enforcement coordination rather than logistics design. Clark managed security, discipline, and response, ensuring instructions carried consequences when ignored. Other associates handled trucking, financial routing, and storage, each compartmentalized to prevent full visibility. Nobody needed origin stories since function mattered more than background. Roles stayed narrow, reinforcing stability even when individual pieces fell away. Money accumulation followed the same discipline, treated as inventory rather than personal reward. Cash moved through laundering channels involving front businesses, jewelers, real estate intermediaries, and cryptocurrency conversions. High-value items like rare motorcycles, luxury vehicles, and artwork served as storage rather than display, parked in warehouses across Mexico City. Wedding avoided public indulgence, maintaining low-profile routines that blended into affluent neighborhoods without drawing attention. Wealth existed as leverage and insulation, not identity. As volume increased, so did quiet attention from international agencies tracking patterns rather than personalities. Indictments remained sealed, wiretaps expanded, and surveillance tightened around associates rather than leadership. Weddings' names surfaced in intelligence reports without photographs, reinforcing anonymity while signaling importance. Visibility crept upward silently, measured through seizures and intercepted communications. Even then, identity stayed blurred, protected by layers built through patience rather than force. The first public cracks appeared through investigations in Canada, where detectives began tracing homicides tied indirectly to cocaine disputes rather than visible gang conflicts. In November 2023, Ontario Provincial Police responded to a double homicide in Caledon involving Jagtar Singh Sidhu, aged 57, and his wife Harbhajan Kaur Sidhu, aged 55. The couple, visiting family from India, were shot inside a rental home, while their daughter survived with severe injuries. Investigators later determined the victims were not traffickers, marking the attack as a case of misidentification tied to stolen product. That killing sent ripples through law enforcement circles since the brutality did not match the victims' profiles or surroundings. Evidence pointed toward enforcement messaging rather than personal grievance, raising alarms about command-directed violence. The error itself carried meaning, since mistaken targets still served as warnings to others inside the network. Responsibility traced upward through communications rather than physical presence, complicating accountability. The consequence chain widened, affecting families entirely removed from criminal involvement. In May 2024, another homicide occurred in Ontario, involving a man connected to unresolved drug debts, further tightening investigative focus. This time, patterns emerged linking payment disputes, encrypted messaging, and cross-border coordination. Surveillance identified operatives trained in Mexico, suggesting enforcement decisions originated far beyond Canadian streets. Violence functioned internally as a signal, reminding participants of the cost attached to deviation. Fear became operational glue, reinforcing compliance without constant oversight. As pressure increased, paranoia followed naturally, affecting communication rhythms and trust across the organization. Associates limited contact, rotated devices, and questioned loyalty, disrupting the smooth flow that once defined operations. Witnesses faced implicit threats, knowing silence protected survival, while cooperation invited retaliation. Investigators documented intimidation tactics aimed at discouraging testimony, including surveillance of family members and financial pressure. The network began showing strain, though leadership remained insulated. Jonathan Acevedo Garcia eventually emerged as an unseen fracture point, having grown increasingly uneasy as violence escalated beyond control. By late 2023, he quietly initiated contact with authorities, providing insight into routes, roles, and command structure. Cooperation did not surface publicly, though it altered investigative momentum significantly. Information, once compartmentalized, began aligning across agencies, exposing patterns previously hidden. That shift marked the beginning of internal collapse, though nobody inside recognized it immediately. Operation Giant Slalom did not arrive as a dramatic takedown or a single coordinated strike, since it unfolded through accumulation, patience, and quiet alignment across agencies that rarely moved at the same pace. The investigation began as fragmented intelligence shared between American and Canadian authorities, built from shipping anomalies, intercepted communications, and financial trails that refused to stay localized. Each seizure added context rather than conclusions, forcing analysts to map relationships instead of chasing headlines. Agents treated the case like erosion, knowing structures of that size weakened gradually long before they ever collapsed publicly. The strategy depended on time, since rushing would only scatter pieces deeper underground. Arrests started landing on the edges, hitting drivers, facilitators, and financial intermediaries who operated close enough to touch transactions, but far enough from leadership to survive loss. Every flipped defendant filled a gap, clarifying routes, payment systems, and internal discipline rules without exposing the full hierarchy immediately. Seizures followed similar logic, with cocaine loads intercepted in Canada, the United States, and transit zones that once appeared invisible. Each interdiction reduced the margin, increasing stress across the network while leaving the core intact. Authorities measured progress not by totals, but by how much movement slowed after each disruption. By 2024, investigators had linked multiple homicides to enforcement actions ordered from abroad, tightening the scope around leadership decision-making rather than street execution. Wiretaps, encrypted platform access, and cooperating witnesses aligned timelines that previously seemed unrelated. Financial seizures mounted, including cryptocurrency wallets, luxury vehicles, artwork, and properties tied indirectly to laundering schemes. None of it stopped operations outright, though it forced adaptation that increased error rates. The organization continued moving, though no longer smoothly. Public escalation became unavoidable once violence crossed borders and witnesses faced lethal consequences for cooperation. In March 2025, the Federal Bureau of Investigation placed Ryan Wedding on its 10 most wanted fugitives list, attaching a reward initially set at $10 million. That move shifted the case from controlled investigation to forced exposure, dragging a previously blurred figure into international view. Photographs resurfaced, aliases circulated, and physical descriptions replaced coded references. Visibility itself became pressure, altering how allies assessed risk moving forward. Rumors followed quickly, filling gaps left by sealed indictments and limited disclosures. Online speculation painted exaggerated portraits, ranging from invincible cartel kingpin narratives to claims of impending surrender deals. Some reports suggested internal betrayal, while others framed Wedding as protected indefinitely by cartel leadership. Investigators ignored most of it, focusing instead on shrinking corridors and tightening oversight. Noise increased externally, though options narrowed quietly behind the scenes. By late 2025, geography worked against him, since safe zones contracted under surveillance and diplomatic cooperation. Trusted intermediaries disappeared into custody, while remaining contacts hesitated to engage openly. Travel became constrained, communication riskier, and movement patterns easier to predict. The net did not snap shut suddenly, since it closed slowly, tightening with each aligned action. By the end of that year, escape routes existed mostly on paper. The early morning scene at the embassy carried a different weight once the full context settled into place, since that walk followed years of contraction rather than a sudden decision. Phones buzzed across agencies not from surprise but confirmation, signaling that a long-anticipated endpoint had finally arrived. The man stepping forward was no longer an abstract intelligence, since his name now connected seizures, testimonies, and graves across borders. What looked quiet on the surface reflected coordination layered far beneath it. The loop closed where it had been narrowing for years. Questions emerged immediately around whether the moment counted as surrender or arrest, though authorities avoided public resolution. Mexican officials described voluntary appearance, while defense statements framed the transfer as custodial detention. Both narratives existed simultaneously, though neither changed the outcome materially. Jurisdictional agreements were activated quickly, ensuring movement proceeded without delay. The ambiguity mattered less than the fact that hiding no longer functioned. When Wedding appeared in a federal courtroom in California days later, The setting emphasized procedure rather than spectacle. He stood before a judge during an initial appearance, answering routine questions regarding identity, representation, and understanding of charges. No statements explained motives, no reactions addressed outcomes, since the process followed standard protocol. The moment carried weight through accumulation rather than theatrics. Cameras captured restraint rather than collapse. Prosecutors outlined the scope of the indictment methodically, listing counts tied to continuing criminal enterprise charges, international drug trafficking, witness tampering, and multiple murders. Each count referenced specific acts, dates, and cooperating evidence accumulated across years of investigation. The case spanned continents, involving dozens of defendants already convicted or awaiting trial. Mandatory minimums loomed without discussion, implied through statute rather than threat. Scale revealed itself through pages, not speeches. As proceedings moved forward, Wedding entered pre-trial detention without bail, citing flight risk and the severity of charges. The courtroom emptied without ceremony, leaving paperwork and schedules to dictate next steps. What once relied on constant motion now settled into routine containment, governed by timetables rather than instinct. No statements framed the ending, since none were required. A life built around movement ended quietly, contained within process rather than conclusion.